The letter arrived on a Wednesday. It was addressed to a German prisoner of war. The return address was American. He read it 3 times before he understood what it meant. It is the summer of 1944. The war is turning, slowly and at enormous cost, against Germany. Allied armies have landed in Normandy. Soviet forces are pressing from the east, and across the Atlantic, in a flat stretch of rural Kansas that smells of wheat and diesel and cut grass, thousands of German soldiers are living in wooden barracks, eating 3 meals a day, and going to sleep every night without the sound of artillery. Camp Concordia held roughly 4,000 prisoners at its peak. It was one of more than 500 POW camps built across the United States during the war, housing nearly 400,000 German soldiers in total, a number that surprises people when they first encounter it. Among them was a man this story will call Werner Kraft. He had been captured in Tunisia in May 1943, part of the mass surrender that ended the North Africa campaign. He was 24 years old. He had been a school teacher before the war. He had been fighting for 2 years. He arrived in Kansas expecting something specific. He was wrong about almost everything. The train ride from the processing center had taken 3 days. Werner sat with his face close to the window, watching America pass outside. He had been told things about this country. That it was soft, that its soldiers fought without conviction, that its people were distracted by money and entertainment and had no stomach for real war. What he saw through the glass did not match those descriptions. The cities were intact, the roads were full of trucks, the fields were enormous and clearly productive. At one station stop, he counted 14 military transport vehicles in a single line, each loaded and moving. He stopped counting after that. When the train finally slowed and the flat Kansas landscape appeared, wide, dry, an enormous sky pressing down on it, Werner pressed his palm against the glass and held it there. He had never seen a horizon that long. Camp Concordia was not a luxury facility. The barracks were simple wooden structures arranged in rows. The fences were real. The guard towers were manned. No one pretended this was anything other than what it was. But within those facts, something unexpected waited. The first morning, Werner was handed a printed schedule. In German, he read it twice. Breakfast at 6:30, work assignments at 8, lunch at noon, free time from 4 until dinner, lights out at 10, free time. He folded the schedule and put it in his pocket and said nothing. At breakfast, the food was simple: oatmeal, bread, coffee, but there was enough of it. Werner ate everything on his tray. The man beside him, a sergeant from Hamburg named Brandt, looked at his own tray for a long moment before picking up his spoon. "I have not had coffee in 4 months," Brandt said quietly. Werner did not know what to say to that. So he said nothing. The work assignments were the first real surprise. Werner, because of his teaching background, was assigned to assist in the camp's education program. He walked into the classroom building on his second morning and stopped. The room had books, not military manuals, not propaganda. Books: history, mathematics, literature, agriculture. Some were in German, some were in English. One shelf held a complete set of encyclopedias, their spines unbroken, their pages clean. An American civilian named Harold Mercer ran the program. He was in his 50s, with thick glasses and the particular calm of a man who had spent his whole life in classrooms. He looked up when Werner entered and said, in careful German, Good morning. Do you know mathematics? Werner said yes. Good, Mercer said. Some of the men are struggling with algebra. I could use the help. Werner stood in the doorway for another moment, trying to understand the situation. You want me to teach? He said. Mercer looked at him over his glasses. That is what I said. The letter arrived 6 weeks later. It was from Werner's mother in Stuttgart. She had written it in the careful handwriting she used for formal correspondence, the kind she reserved for official documents and important occasions. She wrote that his father was well, that his sister had moved to the countryside, that the bombing had been bad in February, but the house was still standing, that she was glad he was safe, that she prayed for him. At the bottom, in smaller writing, almost as an afterthought, they tell us you are prisoners there. We were told you would be mistreated. But from your letters, it seems this is not true. I do not understand the Americans. Werner read that last line several times. He thought about how to answer it. The question his mother had raised was one that Werner himself was still working through. The camp's treatment of prisoners was governed by the Geneva Convention, which the United States followed with a deliberateness that the prisoners noticed. Red Cross representatives visited regularly. Complaints could be filed and were sometimes acted upon. The food met minimum nutritional standards and usually exceeded them. But the letter of the law did not explain what Werner was actually experiencing. It did not explain Harold Mercer, who brought his own books from home to supplement the classroom shelves and who stayed late on Tuesdays to work through problems with men who hadn't studied in years. It did not explain the camp commander, Colonel James Whitfield, who held weekly meetings with the prisoner leadership and actually listened, to their concerns about the barracks' ventilation and the quality of the medical supplies. It did not explain the guard named Peterson, who was 20 years old and from Minnesota, and who had started teaching himself German from a dictionary he kept in his breast pocket, not to interrogate anyone, but because, as he explained to Werner one afternoon, I figured if I'm going to spend 2 years with you all, I should probably be able to talk to you. None of this fit the picture Werner had been given. Werner's classroom held 14 men. They ranged in age from 19 to 41. They had been farmers, mechanics, a dentist, 2 factory workers, and a man who had owned a bakery in Düsseldorf. The war had made them all the same thing. Being here was making them something else, though Werner could not yet name what that was. The algebra sessions went well, but Werner noticed something. The men were not just learning mathematics, they were asking questions. About America, about how the country was organized, about whether it was true that ordinary workers owned cars, about the farms they could see from the fence line, who owned them, how large they were, whether the owners worked the land themselves or hired others. One afternoon, a man named Fischer, the former bakery owner, pointed at a tractor visible in the distance and asked how much something like that cost. Werner didn't know. He asked Mercer the next day. Mercer told him, then added, almost as an aside, that the farmer who owned that particular machine had bought it on credit, which he would pay back over 5 years from the income the machine helped him generate. Werner brought this back to the classroom. Fischer sat with it for a long moment. He owns the machine before he can pay for it, he said. Apparently, Werner said. Fischer looked out the window at the distant tractor. He did not say anything else, But Werner noticed that he came back to the classroom the next day with a list of questions written on a folded piece of paper. There was one afternoon Werner thought about for years afterward. He was walking back from the classroom when he passed the camp infirmary. Through the open door, he heard voices. An American medic and a German prisoner, both talking at once, neither understanding the other, both getting louder as if volume might solve the problem. Werner stopped. He stepped inside. The prisoner had a deep cut on his forearm, already bandaged but clearly causing pain. The medic was trying to ask about allergies. The prisoner thought he was being accused of something. Werner translated. 2 sentences in each direction. The medic relaxed. The prisoner relaxed. The medic cleaned and redressed the wound with careful efficiency, then looked at Werner and said simply, "Thanks." Werner walked back out into the afternoon sun. It was such a small thing, a 2-minute interruption in an ordinary day. He thought about it for years. The hardest moment came in October. A new group of prisoners arrived from France, transferred from a temporary camp near the coast. They were younger than the men Werner had come to know. Some were barely 18. They had been captured in August, in the weeks following the Normandy breakout, and they had seen things that the Tunisia veterans had not. One of them, a boy named Klaus, refused to eat for 3 days. He sat on his bunk with his back against the wall and his knees pulled up and said nothing to anyone. On the 4th day, Werner went and sat beside him. He did not say anything either at first. The 2 of them sat in the quiet of the barracks, afternoon light coming through the windows in long yellow bars. After a while, Klaus said without looking up, "My whole unit is dead." Werner said nothing. "We were 17 men," Klaus said. "We were crossing a road. There was an airstrike." He stopped. "I was the only one who reached the ditch." Werner looked at the yellow bars of light on the floor. "I know," he said finally. Not that he had experienced the same thing, just that he understood what the boy was carrying. Klaus ate dinner that evening. Werner never mentioned the conversation to anyone. By winter, something had shifted in the camp that was difficult to describe precisely. The fear had gone. Not the homesickness, that never went. Not the grief or the uncertainty about what waited on the other side of the war. But the particular tension of men who believe they are in danger had slowly, over months, dissolved. What replaced it was stranger. Curiosity. The men read, they argued, they played chess and cards with an intensity that surprised even themselves. A small group started a camp newspaper in German, which ran to 4 pages and covered everything from the results of the camp football league to editorials about agricultural policy that grew surprisingly heated. Werner taught algebra, then geometry, then began a basic English class that filled up within a week. The men wanted to learn, not because they were told to, but because the language was everywhere around them, and understanding it felt, in some indefinable way, like power. One evening, Werner sat in the classroom after the others had gone and looked at the shelf of books. He thought about his mother's letter. "I do not understand the Americans." He was not sure he understood them either. But he was beginning to think that understanding them might take more than he had originally assumed. The letter he wrote back to his mother took 3 drafts. He described the camp accurately, the barracks, the food, the work assignments. He described Mercer and the classroom. He described the guard Peterson, who by November could hold a basic conversation in German and who had started bringing a small bag of apples to share on Sunday afternoons, because he said there was an apple tree behind his family's house and apples in October meant something to him. Werner wrote, "I cannot explain this country to you. I am not sure I can explain it to myself, but I will tell you what I see. I see a place that believes it can afford to treat its enemies with respect. I do not know if this is wisdom or arrogance or something else entirely, but it is real. I see it every day." He paused over the last paragraph for a long time. Then he wrote, "I think about what I will do when the war ends. I do not know the answer, but I think the question is different now than it was when I arrived." He sealed the letter and handed it to the mail officer. The war in Europe ended in May 1945. The news came to Camp Concordia on a Tuesday morning. An American soldier walked through the camp with a megaphone and made the announcement in English, and then someone translated it into German, and for a moment the camp was entirely silent. Then slowly sound returned. Some men wept, some stood very still. Brandt, the sergeant from Hamburg, sat down heavily on a bench in the yard and put his face in his hands, and Werner did not know if he was crying from relief or grief, or something that had no name yet. Werner himself walked to the fence and looked out at the Kansas fields. The wheat was coming up. The sky was enormous. A tractor moved slowly along a distant ridge, small as a toy. He stayed there for a long time. Repatriation took longer than anyone expected. The camp remained open for months after the armistice, as the logistics of moving hundreds of thousands of men back across the Atlantic were worked through. Some prisoners were sent to help with reconstruction in Europe before being returned home. Werner remained in Kansas until late 1946. In that time, he finished teaching the English class, started a second one, and helped Mercer catalogue and organize the classroom library, which had grown considerably from donations by local families who, for reasons Werner never fully understood, had taken an interest in the camp's education program. On his last day, Mercer shook his hand and gave him a dictionary, English-German, small enough to fit in a coat pocket. "For the journey," Mercer said. Werner looked at the dictionary for a moment, then he put it in his pocket. "Thank you," he said, in English. Mercer smiled. "You've been practicing." Werner returned to Stuttgart in November 1946. The city he came back to was not the city he had left. Whole streets were gone. The school where he had taught was a shell. His father had aged in ways that photographs had not conveyed. He found work teaching at a temporary school set up in a surviving church hall. He taught mathematics and eventually English. He was, his students said later, a patient and exacting teacher who had very little tolerance for imprecision, but a great deal of patience for genuine effort. He never spoke much about the camp, but once, late in his career, a student asked him how he had learned English so well. Werner thought for a moment. "I had good teachers," he said. The student pressed him. "Where?" Werner looked at the window for a moment. Outside, the city was rebuilt, alive, full of sound. "Kansas," he said. The student looked puzzled. Werner did not explain further. The dictionary Mercer gave him sat on his desk until the end of his life. The spine was broken from use. Certain pages were marked with small pencil notes in 2 languages, annotations he had made over decades of teaching. His daughter, sorting through his things after he died, found it and almost threw it away. Then she noticed the inscription on the inside cover. It was in English, in Mercer's careful hand. For the journey. H.M. Camp Concordia, 1946. She did not know what Camp Concordia was. She looked it up. She read about the 400,000 German prisoners, the 500 camps, the Geneva Convention protocols, the education programs, the repatriation logistics, the whole vast, quiet machinery of it. She sat for a long time with the dictionary in her hands. Then she thought about her father teaching English to teenagers in a church hall in Stuttgart for 30 years. She thought about where that had started. She put the dictionary on her own shelf. She left it there.